February 1996, Washington, D.C. A Department of Energy technical report lands on desks across the Capitol. Plutonium, the first 50 years. For the first time, the numbers are published. 111.4 metric tons acquired from 1944 to 1994. Weapons-grade material, reactor fuel, foreign sources. The ledger divides it: strategic stockpile, disposition programs, removals. Then a footnote catches the eye: 3.9 tons in waste streams, 2.1 tons listed as inventory differences. Not missing, just unaccounted for in discrete form. The report treats these figures as routine bookkeeping adjustments, but each tenth of a ton represents enough fissile material for dozens of warheads, now dispersed through tank sludge, buried drums, contaminated soil. The plutonium economy had converted uranium ore into megatons and electricity. What it also created, in millions of gallons across hundreds of sites, was a waste problem without precedent. This is the documented trail of where it all went. 26 September 1944. Hanford Engineer Works, Washington State. Control room operators watch needle gauges climb as neutron counters register the first sustained chain reaction in B reactor. The graphite-moderated, water-cooled pile stretches along the Columbia River, a production reactor designed not for electricity but for grams of plutonium, 239 per ton of irradiated uranium fuel. Manhattan Engineer District planning documents focus on thermal megawatts and isotope yield. Waste streams merit only brief mention. Processed liquids will discharge to soil cribs and ponds. High-activity residues will go to underground storage tanks termed temporary. General Leslie Groves and DuPont engineers had built the facility in 18 months. 5 large canyon buildings will eventually follow, each housing chemical separation lines to dissolve spent fuel rods and extract plutonium. The chemistry is brutal. Nitric acid dissolves uranium slugs, solvent extraction pulls plutonium into organic phase, repeated cycles concentrate the product. What remains? Fission products, unrecovered actinides, process chemicals, flows as alkaline slurry into carbon steel tanks buried in the Central Plateau. Department of Energy summaries compiled decades later note that Hanford ultimately operated 9 plutonium production reactors and 5 reprocessing plants. Together, they processed approximately 110,000 tons of uranium fuel, discharging an estimated 450 billion gallons of liquid effluent to soil disposal sites. High-level and mixed waste, about 210 million litres, or 56 million gallons, was routed into 177 underground tanks. Single-shell tanks built from the 1940s through the 1960s were designed with nominal 20 to 25-year lifetimes. Double-shell tanks, constructed later, added secondary containment, but did not eliminate the fundamental problem. Liquid waste was never meant to sit indefinitely. DOE describes this legacy as chemically complex and diverse. Tanks contain alkaline supernatant nitrate and nitrite salts, sludge layers holding plutonium, americium, strontium-90, cesium-137. Activity levels in some tanks exceed 10 to the 17th becquerels, millions of curies concentrated in steel shells the diameter of a small house. Every kilogram of weapons-grade plutonium recovered for the Cold War arsenal implied far larger volumes of waste. For each gram isolated in pure metal form, hundreds of grams of fission products and process residues were left behind. By the late 1980s, internal DOE and Washington State documents acknowledged that some single-shell tanks had leaked an estimated 900,000 to 1 million gallons into the Vadose zone beneath the tank farms. This outcome was never explicitly planned in wartime design. The contrast was absolute. Mission success above ground, spreading contamination below. February 1996. The same month, DOE released Plutonium, the first 50 years, a report that consolidated U.S. plutonium production, acquisition, and utilization data for the first time in unclassified form. For decades, plutonium flows were fragmented across classified ledgers, known only within specific programs. The 1996 report provided a book inventory table down to tenths of a metric ton. The numbers, 111.4 metric tons of plutonium, acquired between 1944 and 30 September 1994. Of that total, 103.4 tonnes came from government production reactors, approximately 67.3 tonnes from Hanford, 36.1 tonnes from Savannah River site, 1.7 tonnes came from US civilian industry, 5.7 tonnes were acquired from foreign sources. The report also tallied removals. 12.0 tonnes removed from inventory, through fission in test reactors, radioactive decay, measurement losses and waste disposal. The Secretary of Energy emphasised transparency as a non-proliferation and public confidence measure. Openness Initiative documents stressed that accurate fissile material accounting was essential both for arms control verification and for demonstrating responsible stewardship. Yet the report's appendices contained a revealing detail: 3,919 kilograms of plutonium recorded in wastes, and 2,103 kilograms classified as inventory differences. Burial site measurements indicated approximately 3.9 tons in waste forms, slightly exceeding the declared 3.4 tons in the main table. The difference between book inventory and measured waste inventories was small in percentage terms, less than 2% of total acquisitions. But in absolute mass, it represented several tons of plutonium no longer traceable to discrete objects. Some had been consumed in nuclear tests, vaporized into fallout. Some resided in contaminated equipment sent to burial grounds before strict accounting protocols existed. Some existed as residues in processing lines, holed up in ventilation ducts, or particles embedded in facility structures. Inventory differences also reflected the cumulative uncertainty of decades of measurements. Analytical precision in the 1940s and 50s was far coarser than modern mass spectrometry. Even in a highly controlled weapons complex, a few tons of plutonium, enough material for hundreds of warheads if it could be recovered and reprocessed, were now recorded only as waste or inventory difference, not discrete items in vaults. The plutonium economy had operated with remarkable efficiency in its primary mission. Its secondary outputs were proving harder to define. 1982 to 1989. Across the DOE complex and federal regulatory offices, definitions were tightening. Draft DOE orders and National Academy's panel reports worked to distinguish high-level waste, transuranic waste, and low-level waste, categories that would determine disposal pathways for the next century. In the 1950s and 60s, much actinide-bearing residue had gone into shallow trenches classified as low-level waste. The assumption was that dilution, soil sorption, and radioactive decay would render the material benign over time. By the 1980s, performance assessments and groundwater monitoring studies reached a different conclusion. Long-lived alpha emitters such as plutonium-239, plutonium-240, and americium-241 required more stringent isolation. High-level waste was formally defined as the highly radioactive liquid and sludge resulting from spent fuel reprocessing. This was the material in Hanford's and Savannah River's tank farms. Transuranic waste was defined as solid waste contaminated with alpha-emitting transuranic radionuclides with half-lives greater than 20 years and activity exceeding 100 nanocuries per gram. DOE had initially used a threshold of 10 nanocuries per gram, but raised it to 100 in 1982, reducing the volume of material formally requiring deep geologic disposal. At Savannah River, 51 large carbon steel tanks, often cited as 48 in early documentation, stored HLW residues from canyon operations. Policy now assumed these would be immobilized in borosilicate glass rather than held indefinitely in liquid form. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Environmental Protection Agency, and National Academy's panels became key institutional actors defining waste categories and performance goals. National Academy's overviews stressed that these categories were regulatory constructs tied to disposal pathways rather than intrinsic physical differences. A contaminated glove with 150 nanocuries per gram of plutonium required deep geologic isolation. A similar glove with 90 nanocuries per gram could go to a shallow, low-level waste facility. The line was administrative, not radiological. Once TRU and HLW categories were formalized, large volumes of previously buried or stored material now required re-evaluation. Decisions made decades earlier, when waste was waste, with little regulatory distinction, now created obligations extending into the 22nd century. By the time these definitions were codified, tens of thousands of cubic meters of TRU contaminated waste and tens of millions of gallons of HLW already existed in forms never designed to meet the new long-term standards. 1994 to 2012, Washington, D.C. and major DOE sites. After the Cold War, the Department of Energy and the White House publicly declared that significant quantities of military plutonium were surplus to defense needs. During the arms race, essentially all separated weapons-grade plutonium had been assumed strategically essential. By the mid-1990s, Government Accountability Office reports listed a national inventory of 99.5 metric tons, divided into 46.8 tons reserved for national security and 52.7 tons declared excess. The 2012 DOE Plutonium Inventory Update provided refined figures. As of 30 September 2009, US government holdings totaled 95.4 metric tons, 81.3 tons weapons grade, 12.7 tons fuel grade, 1.4 tons power reactor grade. Weapons grade material, plutonium with more than 90% Pu-239, came from production reactors optimized for short fuel irradiation times. Fuel grade and reactor grade plutonium, with higher fractions of Pu-240 and Pu-241, came from civilian power reactors and test facilities. Excess material existed in multiple forms: pits removed from dismantled warheads, plutonium metal and oxide in storage containers, scrap and residues from fabrication processes. DOE emphasized that the 2009 inventory represented a 4.1 metric ton decrease, roughly 4%, from the 1994 baseline. The reduction came from disposition actions including immobilization, vitrification, and emplacement of TRU waste at the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant in New Mexico. While excess plutonium represented a future disposal obligation, it was not yet counted as waste. Most remained stored under International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards at Pantex in Texas, Savannah River site, and Los Alamos. Disposition plans included fabricating surplus weapons plutonium into mixed oxide fuel for civilian reactors, or immobilizing it in ceramic or glass forms for eventual repository disposal. Agreements between the United States and Russia envisioned each disposing of 34 tons as MOX fuel. Implementation proved slower and more expensive than projected. By the 2010s, only small quantities had been dispositioned. Over 90 tons remained in inventory, and several tons already resided outside any recoverable stock, embedded in waste forms or recorded as measurement and processing losses across decades of operations. 2008 to 2023, international datasets and reprocessing states. An analyst updates a table for the Global Fissile Material Report, listing military and civilian separated plutonium by country. Public attention often focuses on warhead counts, but the International Panel on Fissile Materials and National Academies figures show that separated plutonium, most of it weapon-usable, exists in tonnages larger than deployed warheads might suggest. IPFM's 2008 report estimated a global separated plutonium stockpile of about 500 tons, roughly half military and half civilian. A 2015 National Academies overview cited approximately 495 tons. More recent IPFM and IAEA-based compilations suggested approximately 565 tons by the early 2020s. Around 374 tons were declared civilian in IAEA in FCRC 549 reports. Much of it stored at large reprocessing sites in France, the United Kingdom, Japan, Russia, and India. SIPRI noted that almost half of this stockpile was military and held by the United States and Russia, with approximately 250 tons of plutonium separated from civilian reactor fuel. France's La Hague facility, Britain's Sellafield, and Russia's Mayak complex each held tens of tons of civilian plutonium awaiting fabrication into reactor fuel or long-term storage. Japan's Rokasho reprocessing plant, though delayed, was projected to add several tons per year once operational. These global inventories meant that whatever the United States did With its 95.4 tons, the plutonium economy was international. Civilian fuel cycles in multiple countries generated their own high-level waste streams, TRU residues, and contaminated infrastructure. Each reprocessing plant produced liquid HLW comparable to DOE tank farms. Each MOX fuel fabrication facility generated alpha-contaminated equipment and off-specification material requiring long-term management. While US-Russian agreements envisioned disposing of 68 tons combined as MOX fuel, implementation problems meant the net global separated plutonium stock remained in the hundreds of tons. Associated waste streams accumulated in parallel: vitrified HLW at La Hague, intermediate-level waste at Sellafield, alpha waste at Mayak. The plutonium problem was not American or Russian, it was structural to any state operating a closed nuclear fuel cycle. The waste went where the reprocessing went. 1989 to 2025. Hanford Site, Washington State and Savannah River. Site, South Carolina. A Washington State Department of Ecology webpage described 56 million gallons of highly radioactive and chemically hazardous waste in 177 huge underground tanks at Hanford. The tanks were never intended as permanent disposal. Many single-shell tanks were now beyond their expected lifetimes. Some had leaked. Several double-shell tanks showed signs of corrosion and degradation. Chemical composition varied by tank but followed common patterns. Alkaline supernatant with sodium hydroxide, nitrate and nitrite salts, sludge containing actinides including plutonium in various chemical forms, and fission products with activity in the 10 to the 17th to 10 to the 18th becquerel range, millions of curies per tank. At Savannah River, dozens of carbon steel tanks held similar HLW from canyon reprocessing operations. Contractors reported approximately 35 million gallons in 43 operational tanks by the 2020s, with 8 tanks closed and grouted. Ecology called Hanford's tank waste some of the most dangerous and complicated cleanup work left in the nation. Tank aging, documented leak histories, and regulatory pressure from Washington State drove the decision to vitrify the bulk of HLW, converting it from liquid to solid borosilicate glass for future repository disposal. But vitrification itself generated secondary wastes, off-gas treatment residues, failed equipment, contaminated melter components, and required decades of continuous operations. Engineering challenges were formidable. Waste chemistry varied widely between tanks. Some held concentrated salt cake, others viscous sludge. Retrieval systems had to mobilize material that had stratified and hardened over decades. Mixing and transfer operations risked generating hydrogen gas or disturbing settled solids, creating new safety concerns. The waste treatment and immobilization plant at Hanford, budgeted at over $30 billion by the mid-2020s, remained under construction, with low-activity waste vitrification approved to begin around 2025. Even when all planned HLW was vitrified at Hanford and Savannah River, residual contamination in tank farms and soils would remain. Not all plutonium could be removed or immobilized. Closure plans called for grouting tanks in place, leaving small percentages of waste as permanent underground features. The waste had not disappeared. It had changed form and location, but not hazard. March 1996 to 2024. Defense Waste Processing Facility, Savannah River Site, South Carolina. In 1996, DWPF began routine operation. HLW sludge mixed with glass frit was melted at approximately 1,100 degrees Celsius and poured into stainless steel canisters roughly 3 meters tall and half a meter in diameter. Contractors described it as the world's largest radioactive waste vitrification plant. The original expectation was that a finite number of tanks and canisters could be processed over a few decades, with canisters shipped to a federal repository, then assumed to be Yucca Mountain in Nevada. By 2024, the repository did not exist, and canister numbers and timelines had grown. Contractors reported approximately 4,300 HLW glass canisters produced at DWPF through early 2024. Glass waste storage buildings were being modified for double stacking, with GWSB2 expected to hold up to 4,680 canisters. DOE projected as many as 8,100 canisters over DWPF's extended mission. Glass composition was carefully controlled. Borosilicate glass matrix immobilized radionuclides, including traces of plutonium and americium, within a durable solid. Leach rates in groundwater were measured in grams per square meter per day, extremely low compared to raw sludge. Canisters were designed to withstand handling, transportation, and disposal in a geologic repository. Each canister weighed approximately 2 tons when filled. DOE and contractor news releases underlined that GWSBs were for interim storage, destined for final disposal in a future federal repository. But Yucca Mountain's license application had been suspended in 2010. No alternative repository site had been designated for HLW. Congressional debate over permanent disposal dragged on for years with no resolution. Vitrification stabilized radionuclides into durable glass, greatly reducing leakage risk compared to liquid tanks. But without an HLW repository, all canisters remained at a former production site, under institutional control for the foreseeable future. Savannah River site maintained security, monitoring, and storage infrastructure. The waste had been transformed from a tank integrity problem into a glass canister inventory problem. The question of where it would ultimately go remained unanswered. By the mid-2020s, not a single HLW canister had left the site for geologic disposal. 26 March 1999 to 2025. Waste isolation pilot plant, New Mexico, and generator sites. WIP's underground disposal rooms, excavated embedded salt approximately 650 meters below ground, were shown in DOE and state fact sheets as rows of stacked TRU waste drums and boxes. Before 1970, TRU wastes, including plutonium-contaminated materials, were typically buried in shallow pits. Post-1970, they were placed in retrievable storage, awaiting a repository that opened decades later. WIPP was statutorily authorized for 175,600 cubic meters of TRU waste, including 7,080 cubic meters of remote-handled waste with higher surface dose rates. TRU waste included protective clothing, tools, contaminated equipment, sludges and soils with transuranic alpha activity exceeding 100 nanocuries per gram. Performance assessments and EPA certification aimed for containment over 10,000 years, relying on salt creep to gradually encapsulate waste and prevent radionuclide migration. New Mexico emergency preparedness documents noted that after 20-plus years of debate and regulatory review, WIP began operations on 26 March 1999 as the nation's repository for defense-related transuranic wastes. The first shipment, 2 boxes from Los Alamos National Laboratory, arrived amid protests and litigation that had delayed the opening for years. Opponents questioned whether bedded salt would perform as modeled, whether transportation routes were safe, and whether 10,000-year containment could be credibly assured. As shipments from Los Alamos, Idaho National Laboratory, Hanford and Savannah River continued into the 2020s, TRU waste and embedded plutonium gradually moved from surface pads and buried pits into deep salt. DOE budget documents listed cumulative emplacement volumes. By fiscal year 2007, WIP had emplaced 50,831 cubic meters of TRU waste. By the mid-2020s, emplacement continued at several thousand cubic meters per year, depending on generator site readiness and transportation schedules. However, GAO and National Academy's reports highlighted limited capacity and the unresolved fate of large volumes of buried pre-1970 TRU. Even if WIP filled to its statutory limit, tens of thousands of cubic meters of shallow buried TRU and many tons of plutonium-bearing HLW would still lie outside the repository, in forms never designed for millennial isolation. 1989 to 2025, Hanford Site, Washington State. Cleanup began formally under the 1989 Tri-Party Agreement between DOE, EPA, and Washington State. By 2025, Associated Press and DOE coverage routinely described Hanford as the most contaminated U.S. nuclear site. The wartime goal, rapid plutonium production, had assumed that wastes could later be handled by advanced technology. Decades later, The main mission was no longer production but long-term remediation, with an annual federal budget of approximately $3 billion. Present conditions: 9 reactors, 7 now cocooned in protective barriers, 56 million gallons in 177 tanks, large contaminated soil volumes in the Central Plateau, and groundwater plumes migrating toward the Columbia River. National academies and DOE sources stressed that tank wastes were well past their projected lifespan, underscoring urgency. Some single-shell tanks had been sitting for 70 years. Corrosion, chemical reactions, and thermal cycling had degraded steel shells. Leak detection systems could identify when liquid levels dropped, but once waste entered the vadose zone, recovery was nearly impossible. Washington State sued DOE multiple times over missed cleanup milestones. Federal judges issued consent decrees with binding deadlines. DOE responded that technical challenges, waste retrieval, vitrification plant construction, tank integrity, required more time and funding than originally estimated. The newly approved vitrification of low-activity waste marked a turning point from planning to large-scale treatment. Contractors projected that starting around 2025, thousands of tons of waste per year would be melted into glass, stabilizing the largest volume fraction of tank inventory. But even with vitrification starting, state and federal projections extended key cleanup milestones toward the end of the 21st century. High-level waste treatment would take decades longer, dependent on resolving technical issues in melter design and operations. Soil remediation, groundwater pump and treat, and facility decommissioning would stretch beyond 2100. Hanford's plutonium-related waste would remain under active management for another 2 to 3 generations. This was not cleanup failure. It was the timeline required to stabilize 75 years of accumulated waste in a manner protective of the Columbia River and surrounding communities. 1997 to 2025. Savannah River Site, South Carolina. A DWPF status briefing noted that multiple tanks were now permanently closed, with cement-based grout backfill and regulatory sign-off, and that thousands of HLW canisters stood in glass waste storage buildings. Early SRS documentation had envisaged relatively rapid transfer of canisters to a national repository. Instead, as of the mid-2020s, canisters remained on site in engineered storage buildings, with DOE emphasizing that these were interim storage pending a future federal repository. Tank closures represented significant milestones. Each closure required removing as much waste as technically feasible, typically 99% or more, then filling the empty tank with grout to eliminate void space and prevent subsidence. Residual waste, now encased in cement, was immobilized in place. Monitoring wells surrounded closed tank farms to detect any long-term migration. By 2024, contractors reported 8 tanks closed, with plans for additional closures as waste removal campaigns continued. Outline the numbers: approximately 4,300 canisters produced versus a projected 8,100 by mission completion. Double stacking in GWSB2 increased storage capacity to over 4,600 canisters in that building alone. Additional storage buildings were planned if the mission extended further. Each canister held approximately 1,600 kilograms of glass, immobilizing radioactivity that would otherwise require liquid tank management. A 2024 DOE release noted that GWSBs were destined for final disposal in a future federal repository, underlining dependence on a facility that did not yet exist. Without a repository, SRS remained both a former production complex and a de facto long-term storage site for immobilized HLW. Savannah River Site showed what success looked like in current policy. HLW removed from tanks, vitrified and stored securely on site. Worker doses were controlled, environmental releases minimized, and tank leak risks eliminated for closed tanks. But it also illustrated the bottleneck. No operating HLW repository meant all canisters remained within the plutonium production landscape. The site had shifted from a landscape of liquid tank risk to one of solid glass inventory, but both were tied to the same unanswered question: where will the glass eventually go? 1999 to 2025. WIP, Carlsbad, New Mexico. DOE's Carlsbad Field Office budget. Documents listed cumulative emplacement volumes. By fiscal year 2007, WIP had emplaced 50,831 cubic meters of TRU waste. Life cycle capacity was capped at 175,600 cubic meters. WIP was certified and regulated on the premise that it would isolate TRU waste from the biosphere for 10,000 years. Operational experience, including panel closures and capacity management, showed how finely tuned the system was. Repository layout consisted of disposal panels excavated in Salado Formation salt. Each panel contained multiple rooms. Waste drums and boxes were stacked in rooms, then backfilled with crushed salt and magnesium oxide. Over decades to centuries, salt creep, plastic deformation under lithostatic pressure, would gradually close void spaces and encapsulate waste, limiting brine infiltration and radionuclide transport. Performance assessment models calculated probabilities of human intrusion, brine pocket intersection, and long-term radionuclide migration through fractured salt or up boreholes. EPA and DOE documentation described WIP as the nation's only mined geologic repository for defense TRU waste, with institutional controls planned for 100 years after closure. Institutional controls included land use restrictions, monitoring markers, and records preservation, recognition that human memory and political continuity could not be assumed over 10 millennia. As more TRU was emplaced, including plutonium-bearing sludges exhumed from Los Alamos burial grounds and Idaho calcine bins, WIP became the main endpoint for a certain class of plutonium residues. At the same time, statutory volume limits and operational constraints tightened capacity. The 2014 drum rupture accident in Panel 7, caused by a chemical reaction in a waste drum packed with organic cat litter instead of inorganic absorbent, temporarily halted operations and reduced available capacity. Air monitors detected americium-241 and plutonium-239-240 in underground and surface air samples. The accident cost approximately $500 million to remediate and forced closure of Panel 7 earlier than planned. Once WIPP reached its limit, no second deep TRU repository was currently authorized, raising long-term questions about future TRU disposition and any decision to exhume buried pre-1970 waste from other DOE sites. 2009 to 2025. US DOE complex and international reporting. A composite chart overlaid DOE plutonium mass balances with HLW and TRU waste metrics and global separated stocks. Public discussions often treated nuclear waste as a single category. The data showed multiple distinct fates for plutonium and its associated wastes. US plutonium acquisitions 1944 to 1994, 111.4 tons. Removals, 12.0 tons, including approximately 3.9 tons in wastes and several tons in inventory differences. Inventory, as of 2009, 95.4 tons in government hands. Hanford, 56 million gallons of tank waste in 177 tanks now entering vitrification. Savannah River site, approximately 4,300 canisters produced, capacity expanding toward 8,100. TRU waste, tens of thousands of cubic meters emplaced at WIP, approximately 127,000 cubic meters of pre-1970 buried TRU across 5 DOE sites. Global, approximately 495 to 565 tons of separated plutonium worldwide, civilian plus military. Together, these numbers showed that plutonium now existed as pits, oxides, scrap, HLW glass, TRU drums, calcines, and dispersed contamination, not a single waste pile, but a complex distributed system requiring active management. Some was in monitored inventory at secure sites. Some was immobilized in glass awaiting a repository. Some was in deep salt, isolating it from the biosphere. Some remained in aging tanks or shallow burial grounds, requiring continued surveillance. The plutonium economy had operated for 8 decades. It produced the material for tens of thousands of warheads, powered naval vessels, generated electricity in experimental and civilian reactors. It also produced millions of cubic meters of radioactive waste, billions of gallons of contaminated liquid, and embedded contamination in soils, groundwater, and facility structures across multiple continents. Managing that legacy now consumed billions of dollars annually in the United States alone, with comparable efforts underway in Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and other states. Even with deep repositories, vitrification plants, and tank closures, no major nuclear state had yet completed a closed plutonium waste cycle from production to final disposal. The waste had gone into tanks, glass, salt beds, and soils, but nowhere had it reached a final, irreversible endpoint, 2023 to 2025. Policy forums and technical assessments. A UNIDIR assessment noted that the US plutonium account included approximately 2.4 tons of material balance differences out of 95.4 tons, small in relative terms, but significant in absolute mass. Each 100 kilograms unaccounted for represented enough fissile material for dozens of weapons if it could be recovered and refined. Early reactor and reprocessing designers assumed that improved technology and future repositories would quickly follow production. 8 decades later, much of the world's plutonium and many of its wastes remained in interim configurations. Weapons pits sat in storage bunkers, not warheads. Oxide containers filled vaults at Los Alamos and Savannah River. Vitrified waste stood in buildings designed for decades, not centuries. TRU drums occupied salt rooms while surface burial grounds still held legacy waste. National academies and IPFM documents emphasized that transparent quantitative accounting of fissile materials was a prerequisite for both safety and non-proliferation. Accurate declarations enabled arms control verification. Mass balances revealed where material had gone and where uncertainties remained. Long-term solutions required stable institutions over timescales longer than typical political cycles. Governments changed, budgets fluctuated, public attention moved on. But the plutonium remained, its hazard measured not in election cycles but in half-lives. 24,000 years for plutonium-239, 14 years for plutonium-241. Decisions made from 1944 to 1964 about reactor types, reprocessing chemistry, and waste disposal practices directly produce the tank farms, glass canisters, and salt bed repositories of today. Choices about single-shell versus double-shell tanks, shallow versus deep burial, interim versus permanent storage, each shaped what inventories and cleanup challenges would face subsequent generations. Current choices about disposition and repositories would, in turn, define what future inventories and missing tons look like a century from now. The plutonium economy had converted uranium ore into strategic deterrence and electrical power. It had also converted it into hundreds of tons of separated plutonium and millions of cubic meters of radioactive waste distributed across weapons complexes, reprocessing facilities, research laboratories, and burial grounds on multiple continents. How accurately those materials were accounted for, how effectively they were immobilized, and how securely they were isolated would help determine both nuclear safety and non-proliferation outcomes for generations. The final documentary line was not dramatic, it was factual. The waste had gone into documented forms and locations, and the ERC institutions managing it would need to outlast the hazard itself.